Welcome to the Financial Coaches Podcast, where we talk about how to build your practice from startup to scale up while being the kind of coach your clients crave. Finally, a podcast for financial coaches. Here are your hosts, Maria Casillas and Cody Sizemore.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Financial Coaches Podcast. I'm your co-host, Maria Casillas, joined here by my incredible co-host, Cody Sizemore, and we are thrilled to be here with you today to discuss some more insights that I have when I'm not recording. So I'd love to do that with Cody. He's in a good spot to be able to have some of this discussion today, and so I look forward to doing that. Before we do so, however, I'd like to just say thank you so much to each of you who has tuned in today, and those of you who have tuned in every week for the last however many weeks we've been doing this. We're like on 100 and some weeks, I think. So we really appreciate you, especially if you are an every weeker. And, I think that this might be the first one of this year. Is that possible? I think it is. All right. So that's a good thing that we're going to get started with something that it's a discussion around questions that we tend to ask some of our clients and some of the things that we know better. And yet we start just kind of falling into some of the bad habits. So although this was not intended to necessarily be a first of the year episode, I think it's going to be that way. And so we're going to just jump right in. So Cody, tell me if I'm wrong. Do you know that we're supposed to, as coaches, kind of avoid close-ended questions?
I do.
Okay. I think it's kind of like one of those common knowledge things. Why? Let's start with that. What is the purpose for avoiding those? Have you thought about that at all?
Well, I think that it's probably for a couple reasons. One is because you want people to open up as to what's actually on their mind, what's actually on their heart. So you can get more valuable feedback so that you can understand them on a deeper level. Because if you were to just ask people yes or no questions, it's okay, thanks for your answer. And then you have to think about another question where it's if you have an open-ended question, they'll probably give you an answer that you can then think of another question based off of what they said and get to the desired result a lot more efficiently.
Yeah, that is an A+ student answer. It's almost as if we had talked about this beforehand, but I will admit to you all who are listening today, we did not. So here's the thing. I think a few weeks ago, we talked about one of the books that I had been kind of diving into, and it's the what is it called? The Heart of Laser Focused Coaching. And I was kind of thinking about some of the discussion that we had before. And I think this is one of those things that came up. I'm like, oh, we should have talked about this. And so this will probably be a little bit of a shorter episode, but I wanted to still address some of it. And in the book, one of the answers that it gives for why it's so stinking important that we don't ask these closed-ended questions is because it makes us have to think about the next one. It puts all of the onus on us as coaches to be able to carry that conversation forward. And so I just think that's really cool that the one thing it mentioned is the thing that came to your mind. So way to go. You are an A+ student today. Yeah.
That's why I'm here.
That's great. So the other way of saying that, you guys, is that having those open-ended questions forces the client to do the thinking. So not only does it take that onus off of us, but there's actually a more important reason. And that's that it puts the pressure or the onus onto the client to do that thinking. Now, I use the word pressure, and that sounds kind of negative, but it really just means that it's their job. It's their life. They know what's going on a lot better than we do. And they're going to be able to find more insight if they are the ones who are asked to do that, rather than us basically just throwing spaghetti at the wall and saying, hey, did I get this right? Right. And that's one of the reasons for do that. Having said all of that, there are a couple of questions that are, they come more naturally, at least to me. And Cody, definitely tell me, maybe you've worked through some of this, but there are two specifically that I have come up with that I know I happen to do a little more often than I'm proud to say. And those two questions are, did I get that right? And is it possible that ... So I'm going to focus for a second on, did I get that right? Is that something that only between the two of us, struggle with? Or have you also said that more frequently than you care to admit?
You got that right. I sometimes struggle with that myself.
Smarty pants.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think makes this so difficult for us? Where do we come up with this?
I think that we do it in a way to validate ourselves, both for ourselves, but also for the client as well. Because like on our end, we ask that question because we want to make sure that we understand, right? So that we can then get that confirmation and then take that to the next level or to the next step in the conversation. But I also think that we do it even partially for the client as well, so that we can repeat back to them what they initially said, and then they can confirm that, yes, we heard them correctly, which makes them feel heard and understood. So I think on the surface, that question might seem very valuable. It might seem like a good question to ask. But I'm sure that you're going to be alluding to why maybe a different question might be more effective.
Well, I can. Before I do that, though, I would like to say that's actually one of the things I was thinking as well, is that it's almost like there's two competing teachings. And one of them is what we're saying now, like maybe we don't have to ask these close-ended questions. The other one is how to do reflective, empathetic listening. And with that reflective listening, we do exactly what you just mentioned. We kind of say back to them what we think or how we're interpreting what they're saying. And then we have to ask them, did I get that right? And so I think that really is interesting that we have those competing lessons or teachings that we can kind of wrestle with a little bit. So as we're wrestling with that, I think it's just important to figure out some different ways to ask some of those questions. I think too, when we're talking about reflective listening, it's okay to not say back to them exactly what they said. There are other ways of having them know that we heard what they were saying. And even for us to check in on whether or not we heard it correctly. In the book, and I'm not looking at it right now, but I know they talked about like providing context with our questions. So one way to do that is if you're saying something about like, what about that bothers you? If you just take out the word that and fill in what it is that you're talking about, that what they just said to you that sounds like they bothers them. Say, what about, the way that your husband blew the budget bothers you. So that way you're putting it in there and they understand, oh, she was listening or he was listening to what I said. And we're not actually having to repeat back and parrot back to them. Does that make sense?
It does.
Bad question there. Okay.
Yeah.
And now I got to come up with the next thing. So see, we're always learning, y'all. We're figuring this out. One question that we can ask instead of, did I get that right, is what do you mean by that? So we can reflect back in the way that I just said, and then what did you mean by that? It forces the client to go, oh, you know what? I don't even know if I know what I meant by that. Or if they did know, then they can repeat that to you so that it makes them go a little bit deeper. To your point, Cody, that you mentioned earlier, that we really want them to be able to go a little bit deeper.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. You basically confirm that you understood it and the client also understands that you understood it. But then you come back with that open-ended question of, what did you mean by that? And it not only gets them thinking on a deeper level, but when they respond to you, that oftentimes can lead to probably what you're looking for and what they really need from you as well. So it's a really good way to just kind of like peel back that extra layer on the onion to really get to the heart of things. Yeah.
And I also think that this is a little bit something we were going to talk about a little bit later, but it weaves in very well here. So I'm just going to go with that. You mentioned, asking, I don't remember how you said it, but the idea of grabbing more information from them. And I know that sometimes we'll want to say like, tell me more about that. And we'll want to get details about the story. And one of the things that this book beautifully does is tell us that it's not the story that's important. It's actually the themes that people are sharing with us that are important. And so I think when we talk about asking, what do you mean by that? Or what bothers you about that? We're able to pick up not on the details of a specific story, but on the deeper meaning behind that. And so I think that that's a really important thing too. One other close-ended question that I'd like to share is the idea of, is it possible that? And I mentioned that earlier. So for example, this is something that we would use when we are trying to help the client see another opportunity or another way of looking at something. So if somebody's feeling one way about something and we want to kind of do that positive reframe for them, oftentimes we might fall into that trap of saying, is it possible that your husband, when we were talking about husband blowing a budget, that your husband actually wants to respect the budget and, however we fill in the blank. That is still a close-ended question just because of the way that it's framed, right? Is it possible that?
Right, because people could say yes or no.
Exactly. So I love this because it says the question that they suggest for that is, what if you knew that your husband ... It's asking the same thing, but it's making them think about, okay, so what if I knew that? And it plants that idea in their mind, and it creates that need for them to mull over, what would that result for them? How would they think about that? How would they feel about that? And you're not even asking the questions, how would you think? How would you feel? It just kind of plants the seed for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So would you mind actually like using that type of question in like an example? Because I think that, I'm getting it, but I think that hearing it in a real example would help me understand it even more. And I know for a fact that would help the listeners too.
Yeah. So give me a scenario that you might have with one of your clients. Just a quick one. We're not going to dive too deep.
Like with like a husband and wife?
It doesn't matter. It could be it could be that. It doesn't have to be money related.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we say that there's a situation to where there's the wife, she is being very diligent with like, trying to be intentional with the spending and being consistent with like tracking things and whatnot. But the husband has a hard time with that, and he just ends up spending recklessly, let's just say.
Okay.
And that's causing friction between the two of them.
Okay. And which one are you talking to?
The wife.
The wife. Okay. So she's the one who's trying all of this. Husband's not doing it. He's causing friction. Okay. So I'm just trying to think off the cuff here. One of our default questions might be something like, is it possible that your husband is not aware of the level of intention that you're putting into this?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So she could answer yes or no. That's possible. And the only reframe there is, what if you knew that your husband actually just wanted to support you, but wasn't aware of how you were doing that? Or wasn't aware of what you needed from him in order to do that?
Right. And I could see that because, then that could open up the conversation of like, well, I feel like he is aware because I talked to him about it and blah, blah, blah. And I'm the one over here putting in all the effort. And it seems like he's over there just blowing money, blah, blah, blah. And then you could hear from the wife, and then you could maybe, go over to the husband. You could say, so husband, hearing the wife say that, what comes to mind for you? Like, how do you react to that?
Mm-hmm.
And then he would have his chance to be able to, plead his case and say, give his perspective. And, it could be, hey, I actually didn't realize that this is what I was doing. I didn't realize that this was affecting her in this way. And here's why, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that you started with what on that, because we talked about that a couple episodes ago, using what words or what questions. And you said, what comes up for you on that? Another way you could say that is, what do you think about that? What does that, bring up for you? Or that kind of thing. So I really, really like that. So I don't know if that was a good enough example for what you were looking for.
I think so. Yeah. Okay. I think that cleared it up.
Okay, perfect. So another thing that I just want to talk about is I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I want to just talk to you a little bit about it before we close up today. And that's the idea of tell me more. And I think if we can ask, what else can you say about that? It brings up a couple things. First I'm going to say this, only ask that if you actually need the details. And I think that's another thing that we get wrapped up in. That's what I alluded to earlier, that we don't always need the details of something. Sometimes we're just being nosy. We're just looking for backstory because it fills the hour that we're trying to work with somebody. And it actually isn't relevant. In fact, it can be a real distractor for a lot of people if we let people get too into the details of a story rather than the crux of what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to avoid tell me more. But if you actually need to know more details about what it is that they're saying, or maybe there's something that, you can tell that they're kind of getting close to that aha moment and you want to help them get there, rather than saying, tell me more, that's where you would bring in, what else can you say about that? What do you think? And then one thing that I like about this is a lot of times we like to assume that we know that something is bothering a client or we know how they feel about something. And one of the little tricks that the author of this book mentions is you can say something like, what, if anything, bothers you the most? And if you just add that if anything caveat on there, then we are letting them know that we're not assuming that we know better than they are, but we are kind of sensing that there might be something, and we're still giving them that chance for an out.
Yeah, I really like that if anything add. I think that's really powerful. I will say that the tell me more statement, I am a fault of that. I think I even said it today to someone. Tell me more about that. And hearing what you're saying about reframing it to what else can you say about that? To me, I think that that's a really big deal, because the statement of tell me more, it's almost like a demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas the question of what else can you say about that, it's a question kind of thing. So I think that, to the client, when they hear you say, tell me more, it's almost kind of like off-putting in a sense, or I guess it could be. Whereas if you were to say, what else can you say about that? It's definitely more, I don't want to say gentle, but I think it would be better received by the client, and they're going to have probably a higher likelihood of being more open about it.
Yeah. And as you're talking, it kind of reminds me that it almost feels like you aren't really paying attention. Not you. But when we say, tell me more, it's almost like we aren't listening well enough to be able to ask a question. And so we're just saying, keep on talking so I can figure something out. That may or may not be the issue, right? We might not actually be in that space, but as a client, it's like, well, that kind of maybe feels how it feels to me. And so I think that what you said is absolutely very true. I also think that when we have to remember that when we are coaching, it really is more about the questions. And so that's why when I recognize at the beginning of this, that this will be the top of the year, we always talk about, resolutions and how they die and all of that stuff. And so one of the things I like to try to work on each year is my habits, and what habits are really, really good ones and what ones are not so great ones, and which ones are serving me and which ones are harming me, and just to kind of switch those up slowly but surely. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because it's just that idea of, you mentioned, I do this today. You're not alone on that. I mean, I brought these things up because it's something that just naturally comes to me, and I think probably comes to a lot of our listeners as well, because it's habitual. It's just something that we were either taught or we just naturally do on our own. I mean, you and I, even just having these conversations, find ourselves asking those closed-ended questions. And so it's just a reminder, you guys, that you have to be intentional with this stuff. It's not something that's going to come easy. You can absolutely try to change each thing. And like we said one time, put a what, question up on your wall, just a piece of paper that says what, just to remind yourself. But I think also practicing these things is going to be the thing that makes it better. So I think I mentioned before, practice it with your spouse, practice it with your kids, practice it with a sibling. And you don't have to practice it in a way where you're like, hey, y'all, can you just sit down and let me practice this? Just think about the questions that you're asking to these people and try to be intentional with those. You don't have to tell them what you're doing. Just test it out, see what works and what doesn't work. But just kind of start creating some of those new habits as we're meeting with people knee to knee and figuring out what questions are the good ones to ask and what ones are we asking naturally that maybe need to just try to nip in the bud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Love it. Well, thanks for bringing this up today, Maria.
Yeah.
It's a really important topic because, a lot of times we get into coaching and we think that it's all about the numbers, it's all about the spreadsheets. And while that stuff is important, there's a whole other side to financial coaching and the art of asking questions, and more specifically, open-ended questions. It is an art form. And, it's a skill that, you can build up, and it's also a perishable skill too. If you don't practice it regularly, you can lose it. So, my biggest thing for any listeners today to kind of take away from this is I would intentionally check yourself on those questions. Maybe even before you go into a meeting with someone, write down those new open-ended questions at the top of your notes as something to kind of reference, so that if something does come up, you have that little cheat sheet so that you can ask that kind of question. And I think that you might be surprised as to how effective they are. So
yeah, I will actually say this and then we can close up. I actually did that because I don't always trust myself either to do that. And there was one, I thought, you know what? Because I don't believe we should have scripted sessions. That's not going to actually feel authentic for people. But I do agree that having just some generalized questions, I think it's a good way to say it, that could be applied in different scenarios, having them available just to kind of test it out. And there was this one time when I had actually just finished reading and I wrote down some of these questions, and I had a client probably within a day and a half that I was specifically wanting to do this stuff. And I pulled out that sheet and I'm like, I'm just going to try this and see what happens. And it happened to be one of the ones that Nino sat in on with. So I share that because we do that sometimes. We'll tag team. And this particular one we did. And we get done. He's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how far we got today. And I was like, it's just because of these questions. And that was the funniest thing. It was, I couldn't even take credit for it. I said, hey, did you notice this? And he's, yeah. And it's, oh, this is all from this book that we're trying to delve into. And so it was just one of those, I just tried it and it absolutely helped move the client forward. And it didn't feel scripted. It didn't feel inauthentic. It was actually, she didn't know any different. She wouldn't have known what I was going to ask or not. And so it really does work. So I just wanted to share that with all of you. You can actually try it and I bet it'll work for you. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. Go ahead. You were about to say something, Cody.
I was just going to say, great conversation. And I wanted to take a moment just to say thank you for you guys listening. This is the first one of 2025, and 2024 was a lot of fun. And we met some really awesome people through our Facebook group, which is the Financial Coaches Community by New Money Habits. Through people just reaching out to us individually, we've had some really cool conversations with people. And there are some people in here that listen to the show every week. And I think it was like an episode or two ago, I said I wanted to kind of like shout out a couple people who have either told me directly that they're an everyday or an every weeker, or that they put into the Facebook group that they are an every weeker. So I wanted to just shout out one individual. His name is Jesse Hammonds. Jesse, I talked to him probably a couple months ago, and really good guy. He's just getting started with his coaching practice, and he tells me that he listens to every episode every week. And he gets a lot of value from it. So thank you, Jesse, for listening and supporting us. We really do appreciate it. So with that being said, kick off 2025 off on the right foot. Open the right questions with, you know what I'm trying to say. Open the year with the right open-ended questions and see how far it takes you. So with that being said, guys, you guys take care. We'll catch you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Financial Coaches Podcast, brought to you by New Money Habits and Sizemore Financial Coaching. Submit your questions to our hosts by emailing podcast@newmoneyhabits.com. Be sure to subscribe to be notified of future episodes and join our growing group of like-minded coaches on Facebook. And until next time, happy coaching.